Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so when you hear the name Machiavelli, what pops into your head? Probably ruthless manipulation, right? Political backstabbing, maybe a complete lack of morals. But today, we're going to flip that completely on its head. We are stripping away centuries of moral baggage from chapters 17 and 18 of The Prince, and we're going to look at it through a totally different lens, as a pure, structural masterclass in game theory and system survival. Let's kick things off with a question we've all had drilled into us since we were kids. Is honesty actually always the best policy? I mean, think about it. If you're operating in a highly competitive, cutthroat environment, does rigid honesty work, or does it just make you incredibly vulnerable? It's kind of an uncomfortable thought, right? But that's exactly what Machiavelli was trying to solve for leaders trying to survive in a seriously chaotic world. And that brings us to a core insight that, frankly, shocks a lot of people. The idea that survival often requires deception, flexibility, and selective betrayal. At first glance, yeah, that sounds super cynical, but it exposes a fundamental truth about adversarial systems that we absolutely need to unpack today. Machiavelli wasn't saying we shouldn't praise integrity. He was just pointing out a really harsh reality. When you're the only one playing by the rules, those rules become the exact thing that destroys you. So, here is our roadmap for the explainer today. We'll cover the Machiavelli misconception, the danger of rigid predictability, the psychology of appearances, the trust-flexibility trade-off, modern strategy in action, and finally, the ultimate strategic balance. All right, Section 1, the Machiavelli misconception. Let's go ahead and address the massive elephant in the room with these infamous chapters. The core mechanism here isn't just some basic debate about whether lying is good or bad. That completely misses the point. The real question is, do your commitments remain adaptive when the incentive structures around you change? Machiavelli realized that rigidly sticking to promises becomes literally self-destructive when your adversaries don't reciprocate. If the landscape shifts and you refuse to pivot because you're stubbornly attached to a past promise, well, you aren't being noble. You're basically just engineering your own defeat. Moving into Section 2, danger of rigid predictability. Let's see how this creates a hidden structural rule of systems. Systems that cannot violate commitments become exploitable by systems that can. This is the ultimate danger of rigid predictability. If you are perfectly predictable in a competitive arena, like if everyone knows you're going to follow a specific rule no matter what, you're just handing your rivals the exact blueprint to beat you. It's like leaving your playbook open on the field. This is game theory centuries before game theory was even a thing. Total transparency and absolute rigidity don't make you safe. They just make you a giant target. This dynamic sets up some really conflicting forces. Your rivals? Well, they're highly incentivized to exploit your predictable commitments. They'll defect the second it's advantageous for them. Meanwhile, the general population rarely looks at the underlying strategic mechanics. They just really want that comforting appearance of honesty. So where does that leave a leader? It leaves them needing to walk a tightrope, balancing a solid reputation with just enough operational flexibility to actually survive. Section 3, the psychology of appearances. This brings us to a really fascinating psychological question. How do actors actually pull off this strategic deception without everything just falling apart? Well, human psychology gives us a pretty massive loophole. We are incredibly susceptible to narrative framing. First, there's surface morality bias, which basically means we judge visible, outward signals way more heavily than hidden operational realities. Then we have the consistency expectation effect. We just kind of assume that whatever someone commits to today is exactly how they'll act tomorrow. And finally, narrative rationalization. If a leader pulls a fast one, but the outcome ends up being good for the group will almost always retroactively justify the deception. Which brings us to an incredibly powerful takeaway. Most humans evaluate integrity symbolically rather than operationally. As long as a leader controls the narrative and preserves the symbol of being trustworthy, their actual day-to-day operational behavior can be remarkably flexible. Machiavelli completely understood that reputation is crucial, but survival is everything. You can separate the symbol of honesty from the mechanical actions required to stay in the game. Let's look at Section 4, the trust-flexibility trade-off. If total rigidity is a trap, how do we actually balance the need for trust with the need to survive? Have you ever telegraphed your exact moves in a negotiation? You essentially trap yourself in a rigid commitment system. Now, that generates high trust, for sure, but it has terribly low adaptability, leaving you super vulnerable to bad actors.
On the flip side, a flexible commitment system gives you high adaptability and survivability, but the trade-off is lower trust stability. The secret sauce isn't living entirely on the flexible extreme, it's about optimizing for controlled unpredictability. You need room to adapt without torpedoing the trust that holds your alliances together.
But you really have to watch out for the trust erosion loop. This is where Machiavelli's model can totally fail. If a leader leans way too far into flexibility and exposes their deception too often, they trigger repeated deception. That leads straight into severe reputation damage. Next comes alliance instability, because suddenly nobody wants to work with you. And finally, your future transaction costs absolutely skyrocket. You destroy baseline trust entirely, and the whole system collapses because doing literally anything becomes way too difficult.
Moving on to Section 5, Modern Strategy in Action. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is great for 16th century Italian princes, but what about right now? Well, the truth is, this exact model is playing out right now in today's most high-stakes domains. Just look at financial trading. If you have a rigid bias, an adaptive market will absolutely crush you. In chess, predictable patterns are instantly exploited by top players. Over in cybersecurity, deterministic, predictable defense systems are the easiest ones to hack. The most robust architectures are highly adaptive and even deceptive. And in military strategy, rigid doctrine constantly invites defeat. Across the board, controlled unpredictability is your greatest asset. All right, finally, Section 6, the ultimate strategic balance. Let's synthesize all of this. To find the ultimate balance, we actually need to see where Machiavelli's original model falls short today.
Turns out, Machiavelli suffered from a bit of survivorship bias. He heavily studied deceptive rulers who won, but kind of glossed over the ones who triggered that trust erosion loop and lost everything. His model severely underestimates the long-term value of institutional trust. In our hyper-connected modern world, trust is a massive economic multiplier. Rely too heavily on deception today, and you trigger reputational contagion. Word spreads like wildfire, and the systemic friction of doing business will just completely bury you. Because of that, we have to completely toss out this false binary. It is not just a choice between pure honesty and pure deception. If you choose pure unconditional transparency, you're going to get exploited. But if you choose pure deception, you end up completely isolated, unable to build any meaningful alliances. Honestly, both extremes are losing strategies. The optimal approach is what we call the winning model, strategic credibility combined with selective flexibility. You have to cultivate baseline trust to get all those social and economic multipliers, but at the exact same time, you've got to maintain just enough operational opacity so you can pivot when incentives shift. You don't betray commitments lightly, but you also make sure you never back yourself into a corner where your own rigidity guarantees your downfall. So how do you play defense against highly adaptable, deceptive actors? You use these counter strategies. First, reduce information asymmetry wherever you can. And this is crucial. Verify underlying incentives rather than just blindly trusting what people say. Assume that if the incentives change, the behavior is going to change, no matter what was promised. Don't rely just on words. Build actual enforcement and accountability mechanisms to ensure compliance. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Take a hard look at the systems, businesses, and strategies you're dealing with today. Ask yourself, are your rigid commitments actually serving your ultimate goals? Or are you just optimizing for comfortable predictability, effectively making yourself an easy target for anyone willing to be flexible? Remember, in any competitive system, predictability is dangerous. Stay credible, but stay adaptable. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.